Here is a turquoise ink by Van Dieman's Freycinet Aquamarine.
Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink. The paper I'm using here is a Maruman Mnemosyne Notebook.
Right off, I have to say that turquoise is not my thing, but it can still be very nice. This is a cool tone of turquoise that is light and refreshing, but not too light to comfortably read on the page. Every one of the tones that you get is very nice. So yes, there is tone variation by nib, but subtle changes, and you would be able to expect them to step gradually. That's how predictable they change. And it even has a consistent amount of shading that I didn't expect from this going in. Pleasantly pleased in the punctuation of letters. I just felt like a little alliteration. This is a winner for anyone that even likes turquoise a little bit. It is a blue-leaning enough turquoise when it's darker to manage to pass maybe in a professional environment. I think this is a very well done turquoise.
The pen for today is a Mnemosyne Singularity. All of the writing samples are done with a Platinum 3776 with a soft fine nib which writes rather dry, a Hero 7035 with a fine nib that writes wet, a Visconti Van Gogh with a medium nib and an average flow, a Lamy Safari with a broad nib that writes average. Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's take a look at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
Looking at the soft fine, this is the lightest tone that we're going to get. Now, it's easy to read on the page. I can't tell how well it's going to come through until I get in the edit, but in person it's very easy to read. It's not feathering, it's not spreading, it is shading fairly well in just about every word. Look at because and it right on the top line. Plenty of shading, not a problem. I think this is doing exceedingly well considering my expectations going in. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is darker than it was with the soft fine. It does not feather. It does not spread. It does shade better than it did on the soft fine. You get a lot of much darker letters and plenty of lighter letters. It really does it a lot. Look at not on the second line. Just look at the whole second line. Even dark at the E, lighter at the V, darker at the E, lighter at the N. You gotta love when an ink changes its shade on each letter. Beautiful. Looking at the medium nib, just the taddest bit darker than it was with the wet fine. It does not feather, does not spread. It still brings the shading, but I don't think it's bringing the shading as well as it did with the wet fine, because this is a medium flow pen. I think the wetter pen maybe helped bring some of that a little bit. We'll see. See, looking at dwarves, it starts lighter, works its way much darker, but directly underneath that, it goes lighter to darker again. Same with seams, and great. Very nice performance. Looking at the broad nib, it is just about the same tone as it was with the medium, yet somehow looks just a little bit brighter here, which is, I think, helped with the wider lines. Now, it's not feathering, it's not spreading. It does shade some. You can see it in and on the first line, dragons on the first line. You see it in holes on the second line. It's not shading as well as it did. This is a dry to medium flow. It's not quite medium flow as a pen. I think if this was a little wetter, it would be nicer.
Like most inks, this one comes in a bottle.
This is how the Pilot Custom 823 fits. And here is the Pelican M1000. Here is the ink level when you can no longer fill a Lamy Safari. There's approximately 6 milliliters of ink left.
The next writing sample is done in a Portage reporter's notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is the same tone that we got on the Clairfontaine. It is not dulled at all. It is completely there, the same. It's not feathering, it's not spreading. It is shading, but not as well as it did on the Clairfontaine. But it is shading some. You can see it in his and mouth and shut, and he loved. You see shading show up a bit in each word, and I think it's doing it very nicely for this paper. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is darker than it was with the soft fine. It's right about the same tone as it was on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather. It does not spread. I think it's shading just as well as it did on the Clairfontaine, which is really speaking to how good this ink is, that it is managing to still shade and do a good job on paper not made for fountain pens. Looking at the medium nib, a tad bit darker than it was with the wet fine. Same tone as it is on the Clairfontaine. No feather, no spread, still bringing the shading, just the same amount of shading that we got on the Clairfontaine. Looking at these side by side, other than the texture of the paper to feel them, you might not realize that this paper's not Clairfontaine because the ink is doing such a good job on it. Looking at the broad nib, it's a little bit darker than it was with the medium, right about the same tone as it is on the Clairfontaine. It doesn't have the bright look that the Clairfontaine did. That's the only thing that's being lost here, is the bright look from the Clairfontaine. That's it. Still fantastic with no feather, no spread. It's shading very nicely. Look at Dragons, how the D is a mid-tone, the R gets dark, the A gets very light, the G has light and dark tones in it. Looking at the back of the page, you see that we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is immediately put into water for 10 to 15 seconds. The one on the right, marked with a D, is let dry for 10 minutes before putting it into water. The next writing sample is done on a national brand Steno notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is about the same darkness as it was on the Clairfontaine, but we're getting some effect from the tone of the paper as we would expect. Not so much that makes it look green leaning, but makes it look much more in the middle of being a blue leaning or green leaning. I know that sounds really weird to try and describe as neither of them yet. Hints of both. With no feather, with no spread, it does shade slightly, not nearly as well as it did on any of the other papers, but there is a little bit of shading. Looking at the wet fine nib, it's a little darker, quite a bit darker than it was on the soft fine nib. It's darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. It is not feathering. It is not spreading. It is not shading. I'm going to take that back because I see a couple of spots. I'm looking at the third line. I see fastened, it, upon, but I'm not seeing a lot of shading most other places. So it shows it can do it, but it's just not a ton. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the wet fine. A little bit lighter, no, a little bit darker than it was on the Clairefontaine. Little bit different tone, just as we've really seen here, a little bit more towards green, really right in the middle. It's got a slight bit in person of the green look or blue look, and it's just like at the moment in what your eye picks up. Really interesting because it almost has that kind of chameleon look to it, with no feather, with no spread, with no shading whatsoever, but a very interesting tone for how it behaves. Looking at the broad nib, it is darker than it was with the medium nib, lighter than it was on the Clairefontaine. Certainly see it leaning a little bit more towards green here, and it's just slightly. It's just enough leaning towards green with the broad that you see it, especially next to the Clairefontaine. Does it feather? Yes, it does, just a little bit. You see it in we on the first line. You see it in idea on the second line. You see it in going east on the third line, and careful on the fourth line. Fairly consistent. There's a little bit of spread, fairly consistent, and no shading. Looking at the back of the page, you see that the ghosting is fairly under control on the medium and the broad. It did get deeper into the page, but nothing bled through, touching the page underneath.
Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. The smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. The highlighter is on the top left, pen flush is on the top right, 1/3 bleach solution is on the bottom left, and water is on the bottom right. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, we get the same tone as we had on the Clairefontaine. We get no feather. We get no spread. We do get shading, but it is not as well as it did on the Clairefontaine, meaning this one's actually performing not as well as the Portage did, surprisingly, right now, this paper. Very shocked with the Rhodia. Now, the shading that's going on, you see it in Gandalf pretty well. You see it in lots on the first line, has on the third line. I wish it shaded a little better. I'm a little surprised. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is a little bit darker than it was with the soft fine, the same tone as the Clairefontaine. It does not feather, it does not spread, it does shade, though what we're getting here is a little bit less shading than I had on the Clairefontaine. Once again, a shock. But look at map on the second line. Nice mid-tone to very dark. Should dark to mid-tone to dark again. It can shade. I don't know why this pad is not shading right now. Looking at the medium nib, it is just about the same tone as it was with the wet fine. Just a tad bit lighter than it was on the Clairefontaine. It's not feathering, it's not spreading, it shades very well. Not like camouflage shading when I'm saying that it's doing it very well. I'm saying it because you can spot those areas that are much darker, and it does draw your eye to particular words. I don't tend to see turquoise be amazing shaders, but I think this is doing a fair job at it. Looking at the broad nib, it is a bit darker than it was with the medium. It is the same tone that we had on the Clairefontaine. It does not feather, does not spread, does shade a little bit. It shades less than it did on the Clairefontaine, which is what we're getting on this page. quite continuously. Also, it's lacking that brightness that was there on the Clairfontaine. It's beautiful in tone, what we're getting here, but it's lacking that little bit of pop that was there before. Looking at the back of the page, you see that we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Blackstone Blue Cypress. Here is Dieman Tropical Glow. Here is Montegrappa Turquoise. Here is Robert Oster Turquoise. The next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine. What a consistent performer. It's not feathering, it's not spreading. It shades very lightly. If you look at the F in after on the second line, if you look at that, the beginning is darker, it works a little lighter. So there is little bits of shading going on, not as pronounced as before, but I'm very happy to see it happening. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is a little bit darker than it was with the soft fine. It is a little bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It shows up with no feathering, no spread, no shading. It's just there. The wet really kind of ate up the shading in this case. I think we have a nice tone. It's a shame that the shading went away, but that's the paper, not this ink. Looking at the medium nib, it is a tad bit darker than it was with the wet fine, bit lighter than it is on the Clairfontaine. We get no feather, we get no spread, we get no shading. This right here is not my favorite tone because I'm looking at all of them at the same time. Though it's not bad, it's like these slight differences make it a little bit better or worse. The kind of thing explaining that only really people that like ink this much can understand. Looking at the broad nib, it's a tad bit darker than it was with the medium, quite a bit lighter than it is on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather. It does not spread. It does shade. Take a look at the on the first line. Starts a little lighter, gets very dark. Great. Starts lighter, gets dark at the E, lightens up again. That's pretty much the kind of shading that we're seeing here with the broad. Little bits of darker letters thrown into some of the words. Looking at the back of the page, you see that ghosting is no problem whatsoever. You can easily write back here. Bleeding, none to be seen.
While it's nice to see ink in the same color family, I prefer to find an ink that complements its color on the page. Here is a pink ink by Aquamarine, their number 20. Here is an orange ink by Krishna, Orange Honey. Here is a magenta ink by KWZ Maroon. Here is a yellow ink by Kayono Oto Yamabuki Iro. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is a little darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. It doesn't feather. it wants to feather. You can like see it. It doesn't feather, but it does spread, and not all of it spreads. It spreads in any darker areas, which is the spoiler. It does shade a little bit, but when it shades, it spreads. So I think with a very fine dry writer, we're doing pretty good. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is quite a bit darker than it was with the soft fine. It is darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does feather all over the place. It does spread quite a bit, almost to a broad. I'm looking at it next to the broad on the Clairfontaine, and they're almost the same. It does not shade. It does not look good in this case. Largely, the wet fine hasn't done well on the 20-pound copy paper. That's why I've selected these pens, because they expose weakness. Looking at the medium nib, it is actually just a tad bit lighter than we had with the wet fine. Quite a bit lighter than we had on the Clairfontaine. Really dull, flat tone here. It's really lost a lot of what is appealing about this ink to look at the color here. Now, it does feather a little bit. It does spread up to about a broad. It does not shade. Overall, it's kind of gross on this paper. Looking at the broad nib, it is the same tone that we had with the medium, which is quite a bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does feather, it does spread up to that double broad range. You might as well be writing with a marker if you're using a broad on this paper. A wet broad would just be gross. So it's got the feather, it's got the spread, it's got no shading. None of those things are surprising with copy paper. Please stop using copy paper. Looking at the page underneath, you see that it did bleed some with the broad. It did bleed a spot with the medium, tons with the wet fine, absolutely nothing with the soft fine, which is quite a bit drier. And seeing the back of the page, we can completely understand why, looking at exactly how much show through there is. You might get away with it with the soft fine because it's a dry writing pen.
So what nib and pen do I recommend using for this ink? The paper I'm using here is yellow Rhodia paper.
My first thought was the darker, more blue-leaning tone from a wet fine. But I think the wrong thing is sacrificed here when you do that. And it becomes very blue-leaning, and you really do lose some of that crisp, cool feeling of this turquoise. For a pleasant, clean turquoise with enough shading, not tons, but enough to keep me happy, I'm going for a dry, fine pen. Specifically, I said a dry, fine, a dry, broad pen. I don't know why I said fine. I'm looking at it. A dry, broad pen, specifically judging off what I saw from the Clairfontaine. I think if we went with a drier tone, it would really bring out more of the shading there.
I hope you got something out of this video, and I want to remind you that the best way you can support this or any channel is to let retailers know where you've heard of something if you were to go to buy.